Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Gray Matter commentary. Especially welcome those of you watching on Daystar Television. Well, many Canadians have been listening to what's been going on in the world, especially with our Prime Minister and Donald Trump over in Davos, talking about the New World Order. And so I thought we could maybe break this down and try to make sense of it for you. So today's commentary is entitled The New World Order. Carney's Canada is a nation marked by fear. We begin with a quotation from Cicero, who wrote, "A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. For the traitor appears not a traitor. He speaks in the accents familiar to his victims. He appeals to the baseness that lies deep in the hearts of all men. He rots the soul of a nation. He works secretly and unknown in the night to undermine the pillars of a city. He infects the body politic so that it can no longer resist. A murderer is less to be feared." Canada is scared, and it shows. There is a mood settling over this country, and it is not subtle. You can feel it on transit platforms, in grocery aisles, in small businesses fighting to stay open, in the polite but tense conversations among colleagues. We are afraid of the year ahead, not because we are irrational, but because the signals around us are impossible to ignore. We added just over 8,000 new jobs in December, we're told, mostly in the public sector. Our dollar dropped to 71 cents US recently. Small wonder we're afraid. Over 10,000 federal public servants were notified recently that their jobs may be at risk as part of Carney's government plan to cut 28,000 positions over the next 4 years. These are people who voted en masse for Carney last April. Notices were issued across at least a dozen departments, including global affairs and health, transport, agriculture, and Agri-Food Canada. Global Affairs and Health Canada alone saw roughly 4,300 total employees receive notifications, while other departments issued hundreds more. Unions warned that these reductions will impact essential services, causing longer wait times and weaker programs than already exist. Departments are issuing notices to more employees than the targeted cuts to encourage voluntary departures and to minimize involuntary layoffs. Treasury Board data showed that the global affairs workforce grew from about 6,000 employees in 2015 to better than 7,600 during a decade of liberal governance. Such reductions affect both executives and other staff. Departments like Environment and Climate Change Canada plan to eliminate over 800 full-time equivalent positions. Meanwhile, housing still feels out of reach for anyone under 40. Groceries are consuming entire paychecks. The economy limps along while people pray for a rebound, and the dominant national emotion, confirmed again and again in major polls, is fear. Real, sustained, corrosive fear. The reality itself does not allay our concerns. The disparity between Canadian and American per capita GDP is a real difference in productivity. It represents an additional spending power of $22,000 per annum for Americans compared to their Canadian cousins. And remember also that this predates Trump tariffs and is adjusted for currency value. In short, Canada is in big trouble, and we all know it. The dangerous truth is that fear itself is starting to cause more damage than its original causes. Fear, even its perception, changes behavior. It distorts how a nation sees itself. Fear slowly convinces a population that the future is happening to them and not something they can shape. This is the crossroads facing Canada as we enter 2026. And Canadians are bracing for impact. We can see the signs everywhere in media analysis and polling and how people talk about their own futures. We are cutting back on spending, not because we necessarily need to now, but because we are convinced that we will need savings tomorrow. Fear turns wise consumers into hoarders homeowners into worriers, and young people into cynics. Even entrepreneurs, normally the nation's risk takers, are hesitant about the future. Investment slows, hiring freezes, and expansion stall. A fear driven economy shrinks from its own shadow. Fortune, as we know, favors the bold. And parents are now expressing something almost unheard of a decade ago: the knowledge that their kids will not be better off than they were. Young professionals, especially those with skills portable to the US, Europe, or the Gulf, are looking elsewhere to pursue their careers. Though neither dramatic or loud, it is a steady flow. The quiet brain drain is gaining momentum, exacerbating the problem. And beneath it all is a gnawing sense that Canada's global standing is slipping. Geopolitical tensions with the US, the Carney government cozying up to communist China, endless questions about productivity, independence movements in Alberta and Quebec, and uncertainty about where we fit into the shifting world economy all pile onto a national psyche already weighed down by unprecedented cost of living pressures. And once we begin doubting not just our prospects, but those of our nation, then something huge is shifted. Fear is becoming a self fulfilling threat. And it is not passive, it does not sit still, it metastasizes. And when a nation's people feel overwhelmed, it tends to do one of three things: we hunker down, we lash out, or we tap out. All three of these are manifesting themselves today in Canada. Hunkering down involves withdrawal from civic life. There is lower engagement, lower expectations, less willingness to invest, spend, or even to vote. Keep this in mind because it is critical. A country that stops believing in itself becomes incapable of doing great things. Lashing out shows up as political volatility, anger at institutions, mood swings in polls, and the temptation of silver bullet fixes. When national optimism drops, we stop looking for solutions and we find scapegoats. If you follow gray matter, then you know that I am no fan of Mr. Carney or his government. Despite his impressive CV, he has no leadership skills. People need to believe, and leaders, real and enthusiastic ones, address that above all. That is what makes a Donald Trump or a Javier Milei. Then there is tapping out, the most worrying trend of all. It is the family quietly leaving for Texas or Florida, the nurse headed for the UK, the engineer looking at Dubai, the retiree wondering if the country they spent decades believing in and building will still take care of them. It is the most dangerous reaction since it is so difficult to reverse. And fear impacts the weather in a democracy, but sustained fear causes cultural climate change. So, where will Canada be in a year? Well, if nothing changes, if fear continues to guide behavior, then Canada could be in a very different place a year from now. Economically, the country is in danger of drifting into a pattern of sluggish growth and declining productivity, worsened by shrinking ambition. Not a collapse, but something even harder to repair: stagnation. We've experienced this before, so we ought to see the signs. I worry in writing about it that I'm only fomenting fear, but not addressing it is even worse. If we do not face it head on, then we have no chance of meeting the challenges it presents. Culturally, divisions could sharpen as economic pressure amplifies in identity debates that have simmered for years. Trust in institutions already weakened by a decade of liberal governance could erode even further. National confidence, once firmly rooted in being a noble, competent, stable, optimistic Christian country, could fall even further and be replaced by something unfamiliar to Canadians: resignation. On the world stage, under Carney's weak leadership, Canada could inch away from being a destination people seek and become instead a place that citizens reluctantly leave. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, one family at a time. This is what unresolved fear does to a nation. It shrinks it from the inside out. As Ernest Hemingway famously put it in his novel, The Sun Also Rises, quote, "A man goes broke slowly, and then all at once," end quote. And as men go, so go nations. So is fear a choice? And can its damaging effects be reversed? Well, Canada is not yet doomed, but we are absolutely vulnerable. Fear thrives when leadership is timid, when communication is muddled, when economic policy is reactive, and when public confidence is allowed to drift. Canadians are not demanding miracles here. We are simply seeking direction for a sense that 2026 is not something to endure, but an opportunity to build toward a better future. If Carney tells us that deepened trade relations with China is a positive thing for us, then he must ignite that message with enthusiastic words, deeds, and expression. A nation which believes in itself behaves quite differently than one scared of being able to pay the next grocery bill. The real question is whether Canadians will choose confidence or allow fear to become our defining national trait. The coming year will not be determined by forecasts or polls. It will instead be shaped by whether Canadians and our government decide that fear is a warning to be answered, rather than the new permanent state of affairs in Canada. A country can endure a bad year, but it must never lose hope in the promise of its future. That promise was to be reflected in Prime Minister Carney's recent values speech to the World Economic Forum. He stood on stage at Davos recently talking about values and legitimacy. His speech drew praise from leftist politicians worldwide for its critique of great powers using economic integration as leverage, and for outlining a path for middle powers like Canada to act with strength. Carney warned that the old global order is over and emphasized that nostalgia is not a strategy, advocating for cooperation among middle powers to protect sovereignty and resist bullying by countries like the US and Russia. Jaded globalist leaders like Finnish President Alexander Stubb, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, and California Governor Gavin Newsom praised the speech. They called it insightful, courageous, and a reaffirmation of Canada's leadership on the world stage. Former current and Australian officials such as Malcolm Turnbull and Jim Chalmers echoed support, noting that Carney highlighted the importance of standing up to economic and political pressure from imperial powers. European politicians like Carl Bildt and Marco Mickelson lauded the speech for its clarion call to action against hegemonic influence. But adding some sense to the conversation was U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, who criticized the remarks as political posturing, dismissing them as complaints despite Canada's favorable trade deal with the U.S. And it did not take long for the cost of Carney's attack on the U.S. to be counted. Following Carney's Davos speech, President Trump rescinded his invitation to have Canada join his new Board of Peace. Trump characterized Carney's remarks as ungrateful, insisting that Canada, quote, lives because of the United States, end quote. The Board of Peace is intended to oversee the next phase of the Gaza ceasefire and seeks nearly 30 members. Participants are required to contribute $1 billion each. Some U.S. allies, including the UK, France, and Italy, have declined to join right now, though Trump maintains that global interest in the board is high. In addition to this global indignation, Trump also threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian goods over Carney's renewed trade agreement with China. His comments followed Carney's recent trip to Beijing, where Canada and China agreed to ease certain tariffs in exchange for changes affecting Chinese EVs and Canadian agricultural exports. Trump accused Canada of acting as a conduit for Chinese goods into the U.S., warning that such collusion would trigger severe trade retaliation. Carney responded by clarifying that no free trade agreement with China is being pursued. Quote, "We have no intention of doing that with China or any other non-market economy. What we've done with China is to rectify some issues that developed in the last couple of years," end quote. He used the expression back to the future to describe Canada's agreements with China on electric vehicles, agriculture, fish products, and other food products, noting that the difference between now and the past is that there are now additional protections, such as a cap on Chinese electric vehicles. Carney met with Chinese leader Xi Jinping in Beijing during his recent trip to China, where he signed a series of trade agreements with them. While there, Carney said that Canada was in a strategic partnership with Beijing and that the relationship had entered a new era. He also said that progress was made in this partnership with China that sets up well for the, quote, new world order. What does this mean? Nobody knows. Well, Trump initially shrugged off Carney's new agreements with China, telling reporters on the 16th of January, quote, "It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If he can get a deal with China, he should do that," end quote. However, his cabinet later expressed concern about Canada's agreements with China. U.S. Transport Secretary Sean Duffy said that Canada, quote, "will live to regret the day that they let the Chinese Communist Party flood the market with their EVs," end quote. Trump then joined his cabinet in criticizing the agreements on the 24th of January, posting on Truth Social, quote, "If Governor Carney thinks he is going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he is sorely mistaken. China will eat Canada alive, completely devour it, including the destruction of their businesses, social fabric, and general way of life. The last thing the world needs is to have China take over Canada. It's not going to happen, or even come close to happening," end quote. His use of the term governor reflects his view that Canada should be part of the United States. He used the title repeatedly for former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, but thus far had not applied it to Carney. His relations with Carney had been cordial, but soured after Carney criticized U.S. policies in his recent Davos speech. And these tensions heightened between Carney and Trump after they criticized each other's comments on U.S. Canadian international relations in recent public speeches at the World Economic Forum. Meanwhile, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has said that Carney could risk jeopardizing the upcoming USMCA renegotiations for pursuing closer ties to China. But 80% of Canada's trade is with the U.S., while less than 3% of total American trade is with us. All of which leaves Canadians understandably feeling threatened, anxious, and fearful. Now, Carney likes to talk about our values. He even wrote a book with that title. He says that these are Canada's values. But let's take a closer look at what Canada's values are under liberal governance and why so many of us are afraid of where we are being led. On Halloween of last year, just 3 months prior to Carney's sanctimonious Davos performance, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that a 1-year mandatory minimum jail sentence for accessing or possessing child pornography violated the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In an historic 5-4 decision, the mostly Trudeau Liberal-appointed top court said that although such sentences serve the public interest objectives of denunciation and deterrence, they also remove judicial discretion to impose sentences other than imprisonment. You heard that right. Mandatory minimum sentences for possessing images of children being sexually abused are unconstitutional because they do not give judges enough discretion. The Supreme Court explained that a mandatory minimum jail sentence may violate Section 12 Charter protections against cruel and unusual punishment when it leads to grossly disproportionate jail terms, even in a reasonably foreseeable scenario. What does this mean? Well, here's the example they gave. Their example of grossly disproportionate punishment, well, here it is. An 18-year-old man with no criminal record who receives an image constituting child pornography, a sext from his 17-year-old girlfriend, and briefly keeps it on his phone despite knowing that it is child pornography. According to the Supreme Court, sending this person to prison for 1 year would be grossly disproportionate. I expect that many Canadians would agree, but here's the thing. Let us first of all clarify what we are talking about here. Child sexual abuse materials, images of children, real children, being raped, tortured, and otherwise exploited, not sex between teenagers. The Criminal Code of Canada defines child pornography quite specifically, and it excludes consensual images between teenagers who are close in age. Despite this, the Liberal appointed Supreme Court majority created a false hypothetical scenario, a legal fiction, to strike down mandatory sentences for all child pornography possessors, including the very worst material imaginable. Conservative politicians, to their credit, swiftly denounced the ruling. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith called the decision outrageous and urged the Carney government to overturn it using the Section 33 notwithstanding clause. Conservative MP Larry Brock, the party's justice critic, described the SCC judgment as, quote, a disgusting and cruel insult, end quote, to victims of sexual abuse. So what did Prime Minister Carney do to safeguard the Canadian values he bloviated about at Davos? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. He did not condemn the decision. He did not promise to use the notwithstanding clause to correct it. He did not suggest amendments to the criminal code to rectify it. He did not stand up for victims, nor did he even defend children. Instead, 3 months later, he flew to Davos to lecture the world about values. The Liberal Supreme Court has spent a decade protecting criminals. This most recent decision is not an isolated case. I wish it were, but it's part of a pattern showing how the court is being used to reshape Canadian values from Christian ones to liberalism, translated through the cult of secularism. The court has been systematically dismantling law and order protections. On drug trafficking, the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory minimum sentences for repeat drug traffickers were unconstitutional, overturning a policy that required judges to impose a minimum of 1 year in jail to those convicted of multiple trafficking offenses within a 10-year frame. On firearms, the Supreme Court ruled that the 3-year mandatory minimum penalty for possession of a prohibited firearm violated the Charter because it could apply to hypothetical low-risk scenarios. On child luring, the court found that mandatory minimum sentences for child luring were overly broad and could result in sentences that violate Charter protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The pattern is unmistakable. Hypothetical scenarios, reasonably foreseeable low-risk potential offenders. Judges require discretion, which is a euphemism for their own lawmaking power, to shape the law according to their values and not ours. The actual victims of crime, the children being sexually exploited, the communities destroyed by drug trafficking, those being terrorized by gun violence, simply do not matter. What counts is protecting the rights of criminals, the majority of whom these days have not been in the country for very long. This is the liberal vision of social justice. These are their values. Carney's Davos delusion then amounts to him lecturing on a balcony while the house burns beneath him. There is Mark Carney, having flown there on the private jet provided by Canadian taxpayers, telling the world that Canada will lead a coalition of middle powers to defend values and create a new world order based upon legitimacy integrity, and rules. Carney emphasized maintenance of values like human rights and sovereignty. Quote, "We are no longer relying on just the strength of our values, but also on the value of our strength." Kamala Harris would be so proud. The strength of our values. What values exactly, Mark? The value that says possessing child sexual abuse material might not justify prison time? The value that puts the comfort of criminals above the safety of children? The value that creates legal fictions to protect child predators? Carney said that we are calibrating our relationships so their depth reflects our values, and we're prioritizing broad engagement to maximize our influence. Word salad. But Carney's liberal values just destroyed mandatory prison sentences for child pornography possession. His values put drug traffickers back onto our streets. His values protect gun criminals while real victims suffer. And yet, Carney has the sheer, unmitigated gall and audacity to stand upon a stage in Switzerland to lecture the entire world about moral authority. Carney is not here to govern us. He is here to re engineer the operating system of our country, while the Liberal Party provides the helpful stage props and applause track. And judging by how little scrutiny this government receives, the audience seems perfectly content to clap at whatever is placed in front of them, provided that it comes with soothing words like stability, resilience, and the experts all agree. The problem is not that Carney is incompetent. No, the problem is that he is expert at something Canadians never agreed to or wanted. He says that, quote, "Canadians are not being governed, they are being managed," end quote. Most politicians, even Donald Trump, need legislation to impose their will upon the populace, but technocrats do not. They redesign the machinery so that the outcome becomes inevitable. No messy debate, no inconvenient voters, no public reckoning for government malfeasance like the Freedom Convoy, no matter what our federal court of appeal says. Just the framework, the model, the standard, and eventually the quiet conclusion that there is no other alternative to Carney's values. And this is precisely the world that produced Mark Carney. He did not rise through grassroots politics or party service. He rose through academia, central banks, global finance institutions, and elitist green scam bodies that speak fluent acronym and consider democracy inconvenient. Carney does not campaign, he architects. While we were busy arguing about slogans and selfies, Carney was helping to wire the global financial system into a new world order where climate policy is enforced through capital markets, lending rules, disclosure regimes, and regulatory pressure. The real power is not in Parliament anymore, it is in the plumbing. Once that plumbing is installed, governments need not ban anything. They simply make certain activities impossible to finance, impossible to insure, and impossible to justify legally. Then the Liberal Party shows up at the microphone and explains very sadly that the system requires our sacrifice and that we must stop asking questions because the experts have spoken. Carney's values are not neutral either. They are governance tools. They shift politics from what do Canadians want to what does the system require. Once we accept this framing, disagreement becomes irresponsible, objections become unscientific, and dissent becomes dangerous. Opposition becomes criminal. And the Liberal Party is quite happy to stand behind that shield, nod gravely, and inform us that our suffering is simply the price to be paid for being on the right side of history. The beauty of technocratic power is that it does not look like power at all. It looks like inevitability. And inevitability is the favorite costume of totalitarianism. Canadians were sold a lie about a calm, competent adult in the room. What we actually got is an unelected systems engineer quietly converting moral claims into financial constraints. This is not leadership. It is non consensual governance, nor is Parliament debating these structural transformations in any meaningful way. Canadians are not being asked whether we accept the economic costs, the affordability consequences, the industry damage, the regional fallout, or the long term trade implications of Carney's New World Order. We are simply being told that the models demand our obedience. And the Liberal Party, faithful as ever, beams proudly while lecturing us about responsibility and sacrifice from the comfort and power they never earned, despite their six-figure taxpayer-funded salaries. Mark Carney exemplifies a governing class which believes that our role is to comply, to pay, and to remain politely confused and mostly terrified. Canadians are not being governed. We are being managed by fearmongers. Canadians are right to be outraged by this government and its values, because this is what they want. This is their vision of social justice. Soft on crime, soft on child predators, soft on drug traffickers, but hard on law-abiding citizens who just want actual justice, who want to be free to protest publicly about it, who want to own firearms to protect themselves from the criminals being unleashed upon our streets, who want to speak publicly against their government and its values, who want to live in a country they can be proud of, about whose future they can be optimistic, where they can afford to raise families and buy homes, one where they can attend churches to worship the Lord and quote scripture publicly. And most of all, they want a nation in which they can live without fear of impending catastrophe brought on by an immoral and increasingly totalitarian government. In simplest terms, what Canadians seek is restoration of a society with cherished Christian values that we can all proudly call home. We close with a quotation from former Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, who said, "I am a Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship in my own way, free to stand for what I think right, free to choose those who shall govern my country. This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and all mankind."